The word we use for revolution is conversion. We have Jesus embracing a woman as a major presiding theme of our own faith lives. Hi everyone, Angelo here. I'm a creative and theologian, and it's the 32nd Sunday in Ordinary Time. So like always, anytime this happens, I would encourage you to go over to US Catholic's YouTube channel or their website and check out the reflection I would have gotten to do for them for this weekend's liturgy. And big up to them, as always, for all the opportunities. It really does mean a lot. And also, too, I would like to apologize before I get into the reflection of this video, because I'm not well at the moment. And also, I am super emotionally charged, given the US election result. I mean, thank God I just came from school where my students, they either temper me or they drain me. But, well, no, that's just a joke. I love all of them very dearly. So we are in Mark chapter 12. And this is one that a lot of us would know, especially because we have a saying, I believe the saying comes from here, where it's like when we give our 2 cents. So we have Jesus, he teaching, and he's saying things like, we have the scribes who like to walk around in the long robes and greeted in the marketplaces. And basically talking about people who enjoy the fame and the glory and the power. And then here comes a woman today in the treasury and everybody's giving their donations. And here comes this poor widow, because everybody else giving their donations, the rich and the powerful and the wealthy. And then this woman comes and gives, they said, what is the equivalent of a penny, right? She comes and she puts in 2 small coins. And then Jesus calls all his disciples and he says, I tell you solemnly, this poor widow has put in more than all who have contributed to the treasury. Because what he is saying is that the rich and the wealthy and the powerful, they will give the excess that they have, right? And they also use it as a show, whereas for the woman, she gives all she has. She gives from the little she has. So let's keep in mind that just like now in today's times, many people in Jesus' time too held the view that a person who enjoys a lot of wealth, who's rich and powerful, famous, etc., people who I suppose we could call the ultra celebrities then. Just like now, people back then believed that all that was a sign of blessings and favor from God. And I mean, we could see here, even like here in today's society, just like back then too, it was like anybody could just look at another person and they would be able to observe who had God's favor and who didn't have God's favor. So while as much as many of us still have this mentality, I think this gospel story here teaches us that it's actually the opposite. That's what I get from it. That, I mean, I find it super difficult to be on board with this idea that God's favor comes in the form of wealth and power. And when we break down what a blessing is, when we start to take that a little bit deeper, we could find that it's to say something good about someone. A blessing from God isn't a material thing. I mean, we call them blessings, but it seems like it's not so much about the materialism and more about how God looks on us. And I mean, yes, we could use our gains to do good for others, but at the end of the day, the richness that God gives us is the richness of life, the fullness of life, not wealth and power. I mean, wealth and power would come through things like strategic planning and, to be honest, sometimes just damn good fortune. And I mean, nothing wrong with it, honestly. But I think is how people get it, however we get it, and what we do with it. I think that's what matters more so. But when it comes to God's favor, it's what we see here happening in this story. Because the only way Christ acknowledges the wealthy and the powerful in this story is by warning against their vanity and their hypocrisy. Whereas the way he acknowledges the widow is by speaking about her with the utmost respect. He speaks about her in super high regard. And for so many of us who claim to be Christian and to believe in Scripture and the Word of God, I mean, for some reason, it seems like many of us never really take a step back and realize that we have been sold this misinterpretation for centuries. For 2,000 years, we have had this story, and it seems like we praise her for her martyrdom, but that's where it stops. Now, it was never said in the story here, I wouldn't say later on either. But the God I believe in my religious imagination at least, I am sure Jesus either went after her himself or would have sent one, maybe more of his disciples to go meet with her. So even though the story would have never mentioned anything about that, I think there is enough evidence across scripture as a whole to entertain the idea that Christ would have helped her to experience that salvation of God in her life in an even deeper way. And salvation is something that God comes to bring to all of us, whether or not it has to do with this afterlife or end of life salvation. I mean, I can't say. I can't prove or disprove. But I don't doubt that might be the second half of it. I mean, I'm open to that possibility for sure. But the salvation that I have come to know and love, it starts today, is a right now thing. Because God's grace is available to all of us. And the Christian call isn't to just enter into salvation on an individual level, but rather on a more corporal level to bring the message of the good news to all. So the widow here, she brings a message of salvation to us. Not through anything she said, but through the example of her life. She's clearly relying on divine providence day after day. She's living an example of relying on God's grace. At the same time, that doesn't mean that the poor should be forced to live on subsistence while the wealthy and powerful continue to ride their backs with apathy. That's not the will of God. Speaking of the will of God, there's an old saying, a Latin saying I believe it is, that translates something like, the voice of the people is the voice of God. And this isn't a Kamala plug, because to be honest, I have yet to know any politicians that I'm fond of. But if anything, what this US election result has shown me is that money is all you need to do whatever you want in society. That morals and values don't afford you as much as wealth and power and greed. But thankfully, there's also another saying that believe half of what you see and none of what you hear. I mean, I don't know. I just can't wrap my head around the fact that America picked this Trump man again. I can't properly explain what it was like to live there in the US while he was president, other than it was dark times. And more than the media rhetoric, more than political ideologies. But those who experience it know what I'm talking about. They feel it right here. I think the best way I could describe it is that it was an atmosphere of fear. It just shows me that a lot of people don't want someone who is from the grassroots. They want somebody who is different from outside. They want somebody who has a facade of appearing powerful, not someone who rose up from among them, not someone who they would have raised up themselves. And I mean, Jesus showed us a lot about that in Luke 4. Which is why I think Jesus bigs up this woman here too, and why that big up is so important. Because he shows us where our true value ought to be, where our priorities ought to be. In the ordinary people doing the ordinary things in extraordinary ways. Not the ones who are so famous that they continue to get accolades simply because they are famous. It goes to show that 2,000 years isn't enough for us to evolve enough in aligning our thinking with God's. I mean, true revolution, it requires a revolution of the heart first. And the word we use in Catholicism and well, Christianity in general, the word we use for revolution is conversion. And conversion, I would have said in a few videos before, conversion is not about changing your religion, but to turn your heart to God, to orient yourself to God. Which is what I'm convinced Pope Francis was getting at in the new encyclical. But if there's anyone who has already experienced that conversion, is this widow in this story. And Jesus clearly acknowledges her and teaches his disciples, all of us, through her example. And even though there's a narrative, which I very much believe, that the US didn't want a woman to be president, far less a woman of color, we have Jesus embracing a woman as a major presiding theme of our own faith lives. And if we're honest, our current Western society, the way the system is set up, is designed to make it as difficult as possible for our women. Or, to be honest, anybody who wasn't born a heterosexual male, really. And I mean, big up to everybody who helps to try to clear the path. But the reality is we still have so much to do. I don't know. I think I'm angry. I think I'm angry at not being able to have a say in what happens in the world, in a sense. Especially in terms of climate change and peace talks. Because let's be honest, the more developed countries or the developed countries, they're not studying the plight of who they, I suppose, try to be nice and term developing countries. I mean, they came and they colonized us. They eradicated our people. They oppressed even more people from all over the world, brought them here into the Caribbean in particular. They take our resources, then they mess up our economies, they charge us loans, and then they try to dictate we pace. And as much as I limit these gospel reflections here to, well, these video reflections to the gospel, I do encourage you to check out the psalm for today. I mean, check out all the readings, of course, right? Hopefully it's in Mass. But I encourage you to pay attention to the psalm in particular, because it speaks to the heart of what God's will truly is. It gives us hope that God cares, and it inspires us to take action to rise up and raise up those bowed down. And how do we do that? Well, as always, that's something for you to know. Only God could reveal that to you. It could be through philanthropy work. It could be through volunteering. It could be through education or mentoring. I mean, it could be through anything. It could be through embodying your perspective of truth and not compromising on, well, if you're Catholic social teaching. Not that it isn't just only for Catholics, it's for everybody. But not compromising on Catholic social teaching in the interest of the common good. Not just this superficial rhetoric of single issue defenses, because life and societies are a whole lot more complex than that. And complexity is pain and vulnerability and struggle. And so is God's love for us. I mean, clearly, right? Because if not, Christ wouldn't have become flesh and died as he did. And I think that is one of the major reasons why we say that we find salvation in the cross. Not because Jesus needed to pay back God or the devil or whoever needed to get paid back or to be a scapegoat or whatever transactional misinterpretation we might have been sold. I don't think it's about that. I think, and I say that with all due respect to everybody who genuinely searches for the divine in their day-to-day. I mean, everybody, it does in all respect to everybody who has a genuine love for God. But what I'm saying is, I think this woman's actions here, this widow's actions, it brings salvation to us. And Jesus' actions, especially through the cross, bring salvation to us. Because in our suffering, we can recognize God's grace. And this is not to glorify suffering by any means, but to share the perspective that even in all the complex negativity of the world, God is very much still here. We can still find God in all of that. God is still very much with us. And the widow knows this. And this is why Christ is able to recognize her. Even though he was there observing everybody, he still recognized her. Not to pat her on the back for her martyrdom, but to affirm that he sees her struggle and he's in solidarity with her. The difference between Christ and the so-called elite leaders of our world is that Christ enters into the truth of what he preaches. fake leaders, they like to accept the glory because the reward is intoxicating and the power is just too good not to grab onto, which is why they so desperately need our prayers. Because to live a life without God's presence, as presumptuous of me as that might sound, but it is an opinion that I think Jesus also had, by the way, seen in this story here. But to live a life without God's presence sounds like nothing less than hell to me. And nobody deserves that. Nobody ought to experience enslavement and oppression, not even the ones who perpetuate it. And I get that revenge feels good, but trust and believe is not worth it. And is not what God is about ultimately. God is about freedom and unity, not captivity and division. There's a short video on YouTube of Bob Marley I will watch sometimes. It brings me a lot of inspiration. And in it, Bob describes his music as coming from the masses of the people. And he's saying things like, the majority of the world suffer. I mean, of course, everybody in this world suffer, right? No matter where you're from, no matter what your socioeconomic class is. But he's saying that his music come from the masses. I don't really come from the upper class. And I don't think that's there to cause division. But I think it's to root this truth in the fact that God binds with the oppressed. One thing I always try to preach is union with God. And that's what we should be about. That's what we should be about above all else in this life. I think it's the greatest experience we could have in this life. And God wants to be in union with us too. And God starts with the oppressed first. And that means the global south. That means people of color. That means those who don't sell out their people for personal gain. And that means everybody who helps in bringing about justice in the world and raising up those who are bowed down. God wills freedom for us. And this widow here, she gave freely. And the others in the story gave because they were enslaved by ideas of show and wealth and power. But that'll help us soul when the time comes. That just perpetuates the captive mentality. Because the most powerful, they turn around and enslave the people through unjust systems in order to feel liberated. But while they make life hard, and in some senses they do enslave people, in a lot of senses really, if there's one thing people can always have, is the salvation that comes from their relationship with God. And I'm not saying it's easy, by no means, and I'm not saying that it always feels possible. And to be honest, I think it might, more often than not, it doesn't feel possible and does feel possible. At least at first. And I think God understands that, and God ain't go vex at that. We could find union with God through our struggles. We could find union with God through the hardships, even when injustice persists. And as far as I believe, Jesus didn't die to put on a show. He died being in union with God. He died in truth. That same union is the grace that this widow, this woman, helps us to enter to in this story. Not just later on, but we have the opportunity today, right now. Anyways, that's it from me. And as always, I appreciate you so much for watching. Thank you.